Welcome to the Explainer. So glad you're here because we are jumping right into a massive, interconnected historical saga that completely shaped the world we live in today. We're going to unpack a story you probably think you already know, but I promise you, the layers we are about to uncover are absolutely wild. Today, we're looking closely at the pivot points of history and the pedestals we build to remember them.
I mean, think about it. What connects a 15th century Portuguese king, a remote Spanish monastery, and a bitter 1920s rivalry between two New York socialites? It sounds kind of like a riddle, right? But this isn't your standard dry textbook recap. This is a complex, centuries-long mystery driven by the ultimate butterfly effect. Every single event we're exploring today is like a domino falling in real time, connecting the old world, the new world, and the modern monuments we've built to remember the whole shebang.
Section 1. A proposal rejected. Let's look at the early life and initial struggles of a man trying to sell a really radical idea.
Okay, let's dive into this. Where was Columbus actually born? Now, the standard answer you've probably heard is Genoa, Italy. Son of a weaver, boom, done. But history is rarely that neat and tidy. Right now, there are these super careful, intricate DNA studies happening at Granada University. Researchers are looking into ongoing theories that he might actually have been from Majorca or Galicia in northern Spain, or maybe even that he was Portuguese. There's literally a specific home on the island of Majorca that some believe was his family residence. So from the very get-go, his origins are a bit of a historical mystery.
But regardless of where he was actually born, by the 1480s, Columbus was pitching a massive idea to King John II of Portugal, sailing west to reach Asia. And he estimated that distance at 2,400 nautical miles. Now, King John put together a Maritime Advisory Committee, which was essentially this panel of top-tier mathematical experts to review the pitch. Well, they rejected Columbus, and historically speaking, they were absolutely right to do so. They correctly calculated that he had massively underestimated the distance. 2,400 nautical miles was actually only about a quarter of what it truly was.
So at the time, we basically have two competing strategies. Portugal took a mathematically sound, incremental approach, inching south along the African coast, which eventually led to Bartolomé Diaz successfully rounding the Cape of Good Hope. Meanwhile, Columbus is pitching the exact opposite. Just sail west into the total unknown to reach India and China. The dramatic irony here is incredible, isn't it? Portugal's mathematically accurate rejection of a fundamentally flawed proposal is exactly what led to Spain accidentally stumbling into a global empire.
Section 2. Sanctuary at La Rábida. This shifts our narrative over to Spain, showing how one very specific physical location completely grounded the course of history. So, after being rejected by Portugal, and France too, by the way, Columbus is completely misunderstood and pretty much out of options. So he seeks sanctuary at the La Rábida monastery in the Huelva province of Spain. But here's the thing, this wasn't just a place to crash. It turned out to be a hub for some incredible behind-the-scenes networking. Franciscan monks there, specifically Fray Juan Perez, who actually happened to be Queen Isabella's confessor, championed his cause and connected him directly to the Spanish crown. And right there at that exact same monastery, Columbus recruited the skeptical local Pinzona Quintero brothers. They're the ones who provided the local sailors and the very ships, the Pinta and the Niña, that made the journey possible. Literally, this monastery saved the expedition from total obscurity. In fact, there's a specific room inside that monastery that's often called the Bethlehem of America. It's this incredibly simple, modest room featuring Gothic and Mudejar architecture. Yet it was within these simple walls that Columbus managed to convince the Queen's confessor to take his proposal to Isabella just one more time. It is so fascinating how a quiet room in a remote monastery became the launch pad for a brand new global era. And it turns out Columbus was quite the negotiator. 10%. When the Spanish monarchs finally agreed to sponsor this epic voyage, they signed the Capitulations of Santa Fe. And in that document, Columbus successfully negotiated for a 10% cut of all the profits and spoils from his travels, plus a sailor's annual salary and titles to the lands he discovered. He made sure he was heavily invested in the financial success of this highly risky venture. Section 3. 4 voyages west. These are the actual physical expeditions that forever bridge the Old World and the New World. Over 4 major expeditions starting in 1492, he first landed in the Bahamas. Just 6 months later, in 1493, he returned to the Caribbean. Now, this second voyage is really historically significant. Not only did it mark the beginning of Spanish colonization in the Americas, but it also marked the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade for Spain, as a group of 500 slaves was sent back to Europe. By the 1498 voyage, unrest had grown so severe that Columbus was actually accused of mistreatment, arrested, and briefly imprisoned back in Spain. His final voyage in 1502 ended in total disaster when a hurricane destroyed his ships, leaving him and his crew stranded in Jamaica for an entire year. But stepping back from the voyages themselves, these routes triggered the Columbian Exchange. We are talking about a massive, unprecedented transfer of goods that changed global agriculture and diets forever. To Europe went entirely new items like turkey, new spices, and tobacco. And moving over to the Caribbean was sugarcane, introduced from Europe, which would eventually become the foundation of the massive rum industry. Of course, the immediate political fallout of these discoveries was massive, leading to the Treaty of Tordesillas. Because Columbus's accidental discovery of the Americas happened while he was actively trying to beat Portugal to Asia, it instantly sparked a geopolitical crisis. To avoid an outright war between Spain and Portugal, negotiations were held to, quite literally, draw a line on a map. They divided all the newly discovered lands in the New World straight down the middle between the two Catholic powers. Section 4. A Restless Legacy. Columbus died in 1506, but his physical journey was far from over. And this brilliantly illustrates the bizarre, restless, centuries-long journey of Columbus's very own tomb. He died in Valladolid, Spain, back in 1506, but his wish was to be buried in the Americas. So in 1542, his remains were moved across the ocean to Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. Then when Spain lost the Dominican Republic to France in 1795, they packed up his remains and moved them to Havana, Cuba. Finally, 100 years later, in 1895, the tomb was shipped entirely back across the Atlantic to Seville, Spain, where it rests today. It's crazy to think that even in death, he crossed the Atlantic multiple times. Today, the legacy of those events takes different forms depending on where you are. In the United States, the second Monday in October is recognized as Columbus Day, which has been a federal holiday since 1971. In recent years, this has sparked contemporary debates and controversies regarding its link to colonization, with some areas choosing to observe Indigenous Peoples' Day instead. Meanwhile, over in Spain, October 12th is celebrated as Día de la Hispanidad, a national holiday across the country. The legacy of 1492 remains a highly visible and very actively debated part of modern civic life. Section 5. Sculpting the Columbian Myth. Let's transition into the 20th century to see how history is literally monumentalized through art and high-stakes diplomacy. Flash forward to 1929. Just a few decades after the Spanish-American War, Spain hosted the massive Ibero-American Exposition in Seville. This was explicitly designed to bolster relations with former colonies and to mend fences with the United States. And this huge diplomatic push paved the way for wealthy, ambitious American artists to travel over to Spain and physically leave their mark on the landscape. Enter the rivalry. On one hand, we have Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, yes, the founder of the Whitney Museum, who sculpted a towering 100-foot-tall Columbus monument right near the port where he originally set sail. On the other hand, we have Anna Hyatt Huntington, another exceptionally wealthy American sculptor. She created this massive bronze equestrian statue of the Spanish hero El Cid for the Seville Exposition. These two American women engaged in a fierce, high-society artistic rivalry to monumentalize Spanish history in the very places where that history actually happened. Now, what's really fascinating about this situation is how the bitterness of their rivalry is perfectly captured in a letter from Anna Hyatt Huntington to her mother regarding Whitney's reaction to her sculpture. She wrote, quote, "Her mention of it was very lukewarm, said as little as she could and be polite." I mean, you can clearly see the bitter competitive edge between these two. They weren't just making art, they were actively competing for prestige on an international stage, vying to see who could build the grandest tribute to Spain. And the diplomatic weight behind their art, it was absolutely staggering. When Whitney's Columbus Monument was unveiled, the U.S. Navy actually sent cruisers to sail in celebratory maneuvers alongside the Spanish Navy. Not to be outdone, Huntington was personally awarded the Grand Cross of Alfonso XII by the King of Spain himself. Both of these sculptors became high-level tools of cultural diplomacy, tightly intertwining vast American wealth with deep Spanish heritage. Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought. how much of our historical memory is shaped not just by the events themselves, but by the artist and political rivalries that monumentalize them centuries later. I mean, from a mathematically flawed proposal rejected by a Portuguese king, to a quiet room in a Spanish monastery, all the way to a bitter 1920s rivalry over bronze and stone, the history we see today is built layer upon layer. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning those pedestals you see out there, and I'll catch you next time.